welcome everybody near and far. Thank you so much for joining us today in this exploration of hospitality as performance of community. My name is Sarah Lienema. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the University of Guelph, and I am a member of Public's editorial collective. Now, I'd like to begin with a territorial acknowledgement. I'm starting this panel from Guelph, Ontario in Canada. And as a settler, I benefit immensely from the hospitality of this land. I live and work on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, First Nation of the Anishinaabe people. Now, I am delighted to welcome you all to the fourth and final event in this month-long series of online conversation that celebrates the release of Public 61. And extends the journal's interdisciplinary exploration of the currencies of hospitality. So this series brings together Public 61's contributors to share and expand on their projects together. And it's an excellent opportunity facilitated by Zoom. These conversations mobilize and amplify the publication and positioning it as a relay for the exchange of ideas and as a vector for attentive engagement, open debate, and speculation around really important questions of hospitality. Before we dive in, I would like to take a second to give you a little bit of background on Public. So Public was founded in Toronto in 1988. It is an interdisciplinary journal focusing on contemporary visual art and culture. So this journal is led by an editorial committee and supported by the Canada Council of the Arts, the Ontario Arts Council, the School of Arts, Media, Performance and Design at York University, and other private donors and supporters. And so to learn more about Public and previous issues, you can see our website, publicjournal.ca. So today's event, though, is co-hosted by the Digital Media Production Program and the School of Arts at Oxford Brookes University, and we thank them sincerely for their collaboration on this. Now I would like to introduce Sylvie Fortin, a fellow member of Public's editorial committee and an editor of this issue, as you know, Public 61, and of course the convener of this month's series of conversations. So Sylvie is an independent curator, researcher, critic, and editor based between Montreal, New York, and of course, Omaha, where she is a curator in residence from 2019 to 2021 at the Bemis Center for Contemporary Art. Now, Sylvie was also the executive and artistic director of the Biennale de Montréal from 2013 to 2017, the executive editor and director of Art Papers in Atlanta from 2004 to 2012, and curator of Manif d'Art 5, the 5th Quebec City Biennale in 2010. Her reviews have been published in numerous periodicals, including Art Forum International, Art Papers, C Magazine, and Flash Art International. And her essays have appeared in many catalogs, readers, and anthologies. She is also the editor of PASS, the Journal of the International Biennale Association. So at this point, I'd like to pass it over to Sylvie, and a warm welcome to everybody.
Thanks so much, Sarah, for your warm welcome and for the introduction and for acknowledging the land from which we gathered today and for reminding us that as uninvited guests in the Americas, we bear witness to hostility's kinship with hospitality, which is to say to the host-guest-ghost relations that shape hospitality and to the urgency of not only redressing the past, but ensuring futures for all. Thanks also to Carmen Victor, Public Journal's managing editor, for her support today and throughout this entire series. And I'd like to welcome each and every one of you and thank you for joining us today for the exploration of the performative dimensions of hospitality, or to say it differently, today's exploration of performance of hospitality that enable the formation of community. To begin this exploration, I invite you to say hi to each other in the chat and tell us where you are joining us from. And so this will be a nice way to kind of get to know each other as we spend the next hour together. So I'm presently in Omaha, Nebraska, in the very center of the US. Today's session brings together two scholars who've contributed new texts to Public 61. Andrew Stooke and Diego Semerene join us both from London. Our conversations will expand upon their texts to continue our exploration of the hospitality and performance. The session will have three parts. Each speaker will present their work for 15 minutes. Andrew will be presenting first, followed by Diego. I'll then moderate a short conversation between the three of us, and the last 15 minutes will be reserved for you and for your questions. So please don't hesitate to share your questions as you think about them in the chat, and I'll try to consolidate and bring them together to the audience. My colleague Carmen will be our timekeeper and chat monitor. So she'll be sharing information with you in the chat, and you can feel free to download it at the end of the session today. Our session is being recorded. This includes the chat and the Q&A. The recording will be published on YouTube, on our YouTube channel shortly. If you happen to ask a question and then think, oh, I really didn't want that to be public, just let us know, email us today at public@yorku.ca, and we'll be able to edit out that part of the recording. So don't hesitate to reach out. Today's conversation is the fourth and last event in a month-long series of talks. Much like the publication itself, the series is an experiment. Of late, care and slowing down have showed up on many agendas, at times compulsively, and yet often quite abstractly. As a curator and an editor, care and slowing down have meant revisiting all of the relations that make up my practice over the last year. Too often after an exhibition opens or a publication is printed, we behave, even though we will not admit it, as if they were products done and delivered onto the next project. And we rarely step back to assess what actually happens in the show through the publication, except when we have to write reports. And so to care and to slow down means to pay attention to what we've produced, to let it be what it is, instead of limiting it to what we thought or sought it to do or be. To do this together and with others, which is to say to recast the project as a relay and a platform for collective engagement and learning, the beginning rather than the end. And so this is what we're doing with this series. So without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome Andrew Stooke. Andrew is a non-affiliated writer, artist, and researcher based in Shanghai and London. His work in video performance and diverse media has been featured in international festivals and gallery presentation, most recently at Project Anywhere in New York, at the Fajelbo Festival in Fort Lauderdale, Moston Gallery in the UK, the Power Station of Art in Shanghai. His writing on society, contemporary art, and media can be found on various platforms, including Art Asia Pacific, Freeze, Hyperallergic, Art Africa, Art Monthly, Third Text, Art Radar, and Randian. So welcome, Andrew, and welcome everyone.
Thank you very much, Sylvie, for your kind introduction. Certainly the first thing I'd like to say is, again, a further thank you to Sylvie for arranging this and for bringing together all these hospitality panels, and particularly for her calm and patient attention to editing my text for Public 61. As a dyslexic person, one's often fearful of writing things down, and it's rare to find such warmth and generosity. So today I wanted to go somewhere a little bit different to the piece I wrote, but it extends from that piece. And I'm just going to take you to a PowerPoint now, I hope. I'm going to go scroll a little bit back in time from the text for Currencies of Hospitality. And I've been living, as other people have, recently under lockdown in the UK, and I live in a part of southeast London called Bromley. And I became interested in a different instance of hospitality, which was just around the corner from where I am. and it concerns a party that took place in this house, number 8, Plaistow Grove. And staying with the hospitable ambivalences and effects in a very different context, the Southern House Party. Now, the house is the childhood home of the guy on the right-hand side called Bertie Marshall, who was known by the moniker Berlin. And by chance, the house was just 2 doors down from the childhood home of David Bowie, number 4. This is 1976, a few years before the club nights referred to in Public 61, and before the opening of London's nearest equivalent to Studio 54, the Embassy Club in Old Bond Street. Before the Embassy became, and the mega club Heaven opened in 1979, many LGBTQI hospitable venues were very small scale, such as Chagarama's in Covent Garden, later to become the Roxy, an important venue for punk music. The lesbian hangout, Louise's, favoured by the largely underage Bromley contingent. Intimate spaces appealed to the rather closeted, but self-conscious of their difference. The need for larger, more permanent places for a queer nightlife crowd was apparent from the popularity of the Monday gay night event Bang at the Sundowner, a larger venue close to Centre Point, a London office building, notorious for being left unoccupied throughout the 60s and into the early 70s. But Bromley was far out from the centre, and far out too from Brixton, with other exclusive middle-class gay hippie-style activism that squatted communities, eschewed nightclub culture altogether. Seeking to create their own alternative enclaves around the South London Gay Community Centre at 78 Ralton Road, seen here. The House Party, enduring as an important social meeting place in marginalised enclaves throughout the 70s and into the 80s, was recently luminously explored in Steve McQueen's movie Lovers Rock. These events grew in the absence of other places to go, or as a reaction to the commercialisation, membership, high-priced drinks and entrance fees of alternative venues. The party mirrored conventional domestic hospitality. People were invited in, the venues were homes, differentiated from clubs by their unregulated architectural volumes, not designed for mass socializing. Open structures supported an unsettled regime of propriety and unstaffed codes of welcome. In his anecdotal account of the period, in a book entitled Berlin Bromley, Marshall describes the party at Plaistow Grove, called the Berlin Baby Bondage Party. He says, quote, "I spent the afternoon draping every piece of furniture in white sheets. One by one, they turned up to co-host the thing with me. At first, it was just a lot of us sitting around on the ghost furniture, listening to Diamond Dogs, the David Bowie album. Then, as it went on, more and more people turned up. I didn't know any of them, friends of friends," unquote. As in the McQueen movie, the prelude to the event is the removal of the conventional domestic furnishings. As I discussed in Public 61, the interior of the club defies limits. Its extent is lost in darkness. Illuminated features and mirrored surfaces mark out an obscure space. Berlin reduced his home to a ghost-like state, also suggesting the possibility of eroding its physical limits. Into the party's erased household environment, as a preamble, a close circle gathers. It's an inner host group, establishing a presence that is soon to be overwhelmed and absorbed by the guests. Being overwhelmed is unlike the club. In the club situation, the hosts orchestrate the physical space, marshalling guests initially from the street inside. The guests enter an apparently unrestricted space. It gives them a sense of unique freedom. Polarities of obscurity and visibility, privileged access and limitation are conditions of this freedom. The concurrence of host and guest produces a delirium of hegemony. The nightclub enacts ambivalence either in the passage from the surface to the exclusive interior into deeper VIP zones, or in clearly regulating the division of the accessible and the inaccessible. At this house party, it's different. It is the guests, not the hosts, who have traction. Guests can enter and move around oblivious of barriers and no-go areas. They penetrate deeper and deeper. The guests can affect the transformation of space from the collective to the exclusive and intimate at will. Berlin goes on to describe the situation, quote, "The party was on the edge of riot. I kept prowling from room to room. There were only 6 in the entire house to keep a check on what was going on. Bathroom, mostly locked, Steve Jones, Sex Pistols guitarist, fucking many in the bath. Parents' room, Pistols roadie, Niles fucking someone in my parents' bed. I opened the back door and a couple were fucking under the Victorian plum tree. The guests permeate the entire environment," unquote. Marshall, the host, experiences a sense of there being areas from which he is excluded. In clubs, guests ingress into obscure spaces, championed as variously free and protected. In these spaces, there are many ambiguities. The role of guest and host tending to become indeterminate and indefinite while remaining rule-bound. Clubbers sense these rules as spatial disturbances around admittance, door policies, and at Studio 54, the admission to further private inner enclosures. In a slightly different format at Le Palace in Paris, spatial partition was marshalled. Clubbers were allowed in only to find additional unassailable interiors, imagined as being vast, embedded in the darkness. The representation of exposure and exclusion is significant, particularly highlighted in the plethora of Studio 54 images of fantastic dress, enlivened in the glamorous glow of celebrity. The Studio 54 images were often actively solicited by club managers Steve Rubel and Ian Schrager. The representation of past moments of free expression contribute to the ethos of hedonism, identified as contained, separated, and exclusive. As Madison Moore writes in the book Fabulous, certain sets of images celebrate a particular extrovert expression of queer agency, quote, "When we think about people who dress up in wild outfits, seek solace in the nightclub, and are celebrated for their larger-than-life presence, we see how ordinary people reshape the raw material of daily life to produce new aesthetic forms in response to the terribleness of the everyday," unquote. He echoes Marshall's comment, quote, "Every occasion was an opportunity to wear something new and pose, pose, pose." However, the most enduring record of the group gathered at 8 Plaistow Grove Party is seen in the subsequent TV appearance of the Sex Pistols. A selected entourage from the so-called Bromley contingent contingent stand behind the group, but Marshall is absent. To give an idea of the ambience of Bromley, its party, and the subsequent fiasco of this messy television show, I'm going to show a clip from my film about the Bromley contingent. The sequence documents a reenactment of a walk to the party. It's an attempt to return to a point of departure, tracking a route followed by guests who arrive by train. It's another story of a man marked by the image of childhood.
Then they were in my house, so it sort of like crossed the line or something. But anyway, obviously this party with people fucking everywhere, and I think Johnny like threw my little stereo system out the window, and you know, it was a riot, and it went on till dawn. And Susie, who was dressed in a plastic apron and fishnets and nothing else. Oh, it's Susie, Steve, Simon, Simone, Sharon, Tracy, and we're now called the Bromley Contingent. And then it just stuck. It's just a label. We had no idea what the hell that meant or anything. It's a different time, isn't it? 70s, the 20th century. It's like a whole different feeling to it. But it felt like cut off. I mean, it's in Kent. Don't forget.
Are you worried or are you just enjoying yourself?
Enjoying myself.
Are you?
Yeah.
That's what I thought you were doing.
I always wanted to meet you.
Did you really?
Yeah.
We'll meet afterwards, shall we?
Yeah.
Dirty son.
I've always wanted to meet you, Bill.
Just look through your window. Look who sits outside.
I hope I'm not seeing you again. From me, though. Good night.
Not in the way that we're going to compromise anything that we do, which is very hard.
Have you had lots of offers?
No. And that is why, probably.
Andrew, that's time.
Oh, is it? Oh, well, we'll stop there then. But I was going to just speak a little bit more, but there's quite a lot more. So we'll stop at that. We've got a flavour of it.
Great, and we can continue in the Q&A. Thanks so much, Andrew. That was amazing. And now I'd like to welcome Diego Semerene, who's a senior lecturer in film and digital media at Oxford Brookes University. He holds a Ph.D. in media arts from the University of Southern California, and his work has appeared in CM, Communication and Media Journal, Discourse, Frames Cinema Journal, Invisible Culture, and most recently in the anthology Raw Prep, Pedagogy and the Politics of Barebacking, edited by Ricky Varghese at the University of Regina Press in 2019. So welcome, Diego.
Thank you, Sylvie. I want to thank Sylvie and everyone involved in making the event possible. Sometimes we think that if we haven't organized one, it's just like inviting people, starting a Zoom call and then hoping for the best. But I know that there's a lot of painstaking organization behind the scenes, so I appreciate that. I'm also particularly thrilled about speaking after Andrew or alongside Andrew, because I really loved his essay. I was particularly taken with a section where Andrew mentions the usage of glitter in Studio 54, the club, at a New Year's party. So in that section, Andrew writes that, quote, a few weeks before Andy Warhol's opening, there was a party, a New Year's party, and quote, it involved 4 tons of glitter. Traeger described the effect. You felt like you were standing on stardust. People got the glitter in their hair, in their socks. You would see it in people's homes 6 months later, and you knew they'd been at Studio 54. The glitter smuggled itself into the partiers' homes and lives, where it found refuge after the party was over. And so irrespective of even the argument that Andrew made, I just quite appreciate these instances where sheer poetry pops up from theoretical work. And then later in the essay, Andrew will talk about something that I think I recognize as one of the intersecting nodes between our essays. Andrew notes that, quote, the flamboyant queerness expressed inside Studio 54 required obscurity. Illumination stripped it of its glamour. Living as and commingling in shadows was a form of resistance and collectivity. And then later, Andrew also quotes Andy Warhol saying that when you see somebody in light, all the glamour is gone. The question of darkness and what happens when you turn the light on is, I think, what connects these 2 essays. The consequences for subjects and subject of desire specifically, when underexposure becomes overexposure, or subjects for whom any exposure can mean overexposure. I think these are central issues in both of our essays. So in my essay too, I'm exploring the idea of what might be spoiled, but also liberated when we turn the lights off or we switch them back on. And I'm reminded, and here is the trigger warning, that this talk, because it's a talk about the body, will have explicit imageries evoked and explicit language. But so all of this reminded me of a line that I don't have in the essay, but it made me think of a line in the poem Mercury by the American poet Ariana Reines. She writes, when I looked at your cock, my imagination died. And so I think that captures some of what I've been suggesting. So I don't have that much time. What I'll do is give you a brief sense of what my argument in the essay is. And that will basically mean explaining the concept of analytica or analethics, an ethics of the anus, essentially, which is a concept developed by the Spanish philosopher Paco Vidarte, which in his book Etica Marica, which remains untranslated in English, but would be translated as fag ethics, essentially. And also try to articulate what Brazilian trans rapper Linda Quebrada has to do with analytics. And to illustrate my point, I wanted to screen the trailer for the documentary Bicha Travesti, which translates as a tranny fag, which is a 2018 documentary about the trans rapper Linda Quebrada from Brazil. And that will really illustrate a lot of my points. So Sylvie, I'm not sure if you're going to share the screen and show the trailer.
Can you see my screen?
Yeah, but it's not full screen, so you can just make it full screen.
Great. Here we go.
E a costela de Adão. Muito prazer, sou a nova Eva, filha das travas, obra das trevas. Vocês, homens, vocês fizeram tudo muito direitinho, né? Vocês fizeram seus joguinhos, fizeram as suas redes, vocês se ajudaram, vocês estavam fazendo as coisas todas para se protegerem e deixando ao feminino num lugar recluso, competindo por vocês. Mas que joguinho sujo. E acharam que a gente não fosse fazer nada. Ela tem cara de mulher, ela tem corpo de mulher. Corpo de mulher, ela tem jeito, tem bunda, tem peito e um pau de mulher. Ela tem cara de mulher, ela tem corpo de mulher, ela tem jeito, tem bunda, tem peito e um pau de mulher. Afinal, bicha preta, tra, 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 tra. Bicha preta, tra, tra, tra. Bicha preta, tra, 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 tra. A minha pele preta é meu manto de coragem. Funciona o movimento e vai desce a viadagem. Vai, desce. E vai, desce. Desce. Desce a viadagem.
Okay, so that'll give you a sense of Linda Quebrada's performance style and how it relates to the concept of analytics. So in the essay, I begin with a self-ethnographic anecdote, which is a kind of rhetorical strategy that has everything to do with Linda Quebrada, but also Paco Vidarte's theory. You know, this highlighting the figure of the I, but the self-ethnographic anecdote had to do with being a child, being a queer child in a very queer-phobic country growing up, and being from the beginning very much aware that the anus was a problem for men in Brazilian culture, right? So the anus was a problem. The anus was a problem because the anus was an opening, and the anus was a kind of obvious evidence that whoever had an anus was potentially penetrable, right? And so a Brazilian man's anus was in some ways a site of horror to be managed through laughter, denial, or projection, right? So the anus was supposed to be projected as something that other people have had, not men, right? And so in a recent video by Brazilian YouTuber Maíra Medeiros, she actually shows this anxiety around the Brazilian heterosexual anus very clearly when she shares a photograph of one of her followers who, the video was basically about how straight Brazilian men are so afraid of wiping their ass after they go to the bathroom, because if they wipe it too much or too close, any sort of action around that region would make them gay, essentially. And so the photo that one of the followers sent her was the photo of his underwear with a so-called skid mark, which was essentially a trace of his stool, as kind of evidence of his masculinity. because in this kind of context, touching the anus, even with the legitimate goal of ridding one's butt of fecal matter with paper, would turn him gay. So the YouTuber Medeiros then makes a very legitimate point. She remarks the tenuousness of this vision of masculinity, where even a pragmatic contact between toilet paper and the anal rim can cause an identity to collapse. And she says, they are straight by the tiniest of threads. So after that preamble, I segue into the media object and the theoretical framework at hand, namely Linda Quebrada's performance as it appears in the documentary Trainee Fag, and Paco Vidarte's untranslated book Fag Ethics, which is a sort of outburst, scatological outburst of a text without any citations, without footnotes or any bibliographic references. All of which these things, citations, footnotes, bibliographic references for Vidarte, are all oppressive heterosexist systems by design. And so he's refusing those. I then consider da Quebrada's performance practice through the lens of the concept of analethics, or ethics of the anus as proposed by Vidarte. So what is an analethics? It's essentially an ethics of the anus that he crafts in the book to argue that the anus has the potential to become a hospitable site for political resistance and symbolic reparation. The political resistance and the symbolic reparation may follow the rediscovery of this hospitality of the anus. And to lay out the ways in which this hospitality can be performed and the ways in which it can amount to a emancipatory ethics, I look at those two figures, the rapper and the theorist, as examples of what we might call a queer theory from the streets, right? So it's a queer theory that emerges not from the ivory tower of academia, but from peripheral spaces. Both of them recognize the importance of speaking in the first person, as I do in the essay, in the beginning of the essay. Because, I mean, for Vidarte, he reminds us that an individual can only ever belong to a collective in dramatically particular and partial ways. And that unity for Vidarte often leans toward repression, segregation, and silencing. So he's criticizing the ways in which belonging to any sort of collective system or category necessarily erases or something very authentic about the human subject. Analethics, or the ethics of the anus, has is the core principle of the book. He describes it as a stance in the struggle for, quote, orgiastic resistance, happiness, enjoyment, and the use of our bodies. This attitude stands in contrast to what he calls the outdated politica perra, or bitch politics, as in a dog. So he's sketching out this sense of this sort of ethics against a more assimilationist LGBTQ activism that positions gays as men's best friends, straight men's best friends, that is, who live to please their owners like obedient dogs, wagging their tail, playing dead, only pledging loyalty to those who hold treats. And by treats, he means, you know, gay marriage, adoption rights, and garishly well-funded pride parade floats. I'm almost done. So Vidarte proposes another kind of militancy then, in which instead of playing nice to the hegemonic system, in the hopes of receiving some self-serving crumbs from the owner of that system, or, you know, the owners, one would turn oneself into a, quote, dark hole. voraciously swallowing everything in its way, refusing to adjust one's actions to accommodate some other whose position and network of power remain unquestioned. In this form of ethical stance, one would refuse the hospitality of the liberal other by making oneself a hospitable dark hole. The unethical subject for Vidarte takes everything and gives nothing back. Just to sort of begin to sketch out, obviously, if you're interested, you can read the article, but in the documentary, whose trailer you watched, we see a lot of significant points of intersection articulated between Da Quebrada's performance and rhetoric in her lyrics and this kind of anoethics that I just explained. Quebrada's performance presents a simultaneously hostile and hospitable queerness that resists classification and assimilation, because it knows that all forms and performances are provisional and contingent on resignification. Finally, the film combines documentary, fiction, performance art, and the visual essay. And all of these visual strategies structure the film with concepts that mirror the analytical, the core of analytics that I just explained. So the visual tropes of the film, which is punctuated by the performers' vlog-like speeches, suggest the kind of active participation of the filmed object. So here, Linda Quebrada, she is the filmed object, but she also acts like the author of the film itself, escaping this kind of old logic in film studies of to look versus to be looked at, or even the old logic of sexual binaries, to fuck or to be fucked, turning these kind of facile binaries into mockeries, into mockery. So the kinds of trans subject that Da Quebrada presents herself as is a subject that rejects the concept of realness and rejects traditional ways of thinking about transitioning. Hers is a circular type of transness without end. She's stuck in transit, rejecting the normative injunctions that govern, form, and deform trans bodies seeking assimilation. I'll stop here because I think I've gone over my time. I think you're on mute.
Thanks so much.
Okay.
And if everyone can come back on screen. And while people in the attendance can share their questions, I have a couple of things to start out with. And they connect in a way to some of the sessions that we've had over the past few weeks. So for me, one of the biggest theoretical challenge in sort of rethinking hospitality is the fact that hospitality is often, if not always, modeled on the home, and that the home is far from being a neutral space, and it's far from being a necessary beneficial space. The home is, for many women around the world, the site of violence. The home is also something that is sort of withheld from many people around the planet, a growing number of people, because of relocation, be it for political, economic, or environmental questions. So I think that to not question that sort of weddedness of hospitality to the home is to really not be connected to today's reality. So having said all that, I'd like to maybe talk about the kind of spatial performances that are in play in your talks. So, you know, Andrew, you took us to the house party, from the club to the house. And Diego, I think the spaces that we saw in the trailer are, you know, there's sort of no home or no center, or when you were saying that she stuck in transness. She's also in transit perpetually. So maybe if you could share your thoughts on that question. So the architectures, the home performance, and hospitality.
Andrew or Diego, or either?
Either, whoever's ready for it.
I would just say that yes, I mean, when we're thinking about trans subjects, the question of home is always complicated, right? And it's and you mentioned being stuck in transit or being stuck in transness. This is true for multiple human subjects, but particularly true or exacerbated for trans subjects, where the space of the home might be dangerous, violent, and lacking in hospitality for sure. And then we all know that, you know, trans people are oftentimes kicked out of their homes, oftentimes literally. And then if you're kicked out of your home, you might have the street. But then obviously that is also a space that can be very dangerous. And so it sets up this impossible bind, right? Where it's like, where do you go? There is no, I mean, it is a kind of existential impossibility that I wonder. I mean, in the essay, I speak a lot toward the end about psychoanalytic theory, right? And of course, when we think about impossibilities of in relationship to others, we may have the self or sort of as an ultimate site of liberation and understanding, but that can also be a kind of privilege that, and also a very long-term strategy, and bodies that are, or subjects that are stuck in transit like that may not have the benefit of time, right? And so, yeah, these would be my comments. Yeah.
Yeah, I was interested in terms of the home. I mean, the guy I'm talking about, Berlin, of course, does get chucked out of his home. But yeah, I mean, that's one model of home, isn't it? Which is a kind of heteronormative nuclear home. But when he is chucked out, he has places to go, and he goes to live in other sorts of configurations. So I mean, I guess one of the things I was interested in was how those spaces can be transformed, and then rather than them being, if you like, commercialized and controlled by employed hosts and by sort of owners and patrons, the guests who appear in the home begin to sort of reform it and use it for their own ends or whatever they want to do. One of the things as well, which I think kind of connects with that, is the idea of penetration. And in England at the moment, there's been a lot of talk about women being harassed by men, and you know, everybody's testifying. You know, this has happened to me. And one of the ideas which I thought would be interesting would be if in schools, because one of the things they say is you've got to take this right back to schools. If male penetration was taught in rather than penetration being gendered in a male-female way, you'd immediately kind of open a very different debate about what going into a place and who controls the inside and outside, which I guess goes a little bit back to Diego's the sort of fear of the owners thing.
And I think, Andrew, coming back to the sort of glitter story, to me, that was one of these interesting place to think about that relationship where you have, the many tons of glitter and the clubbing, and then it escapes the club and then starts kind of, in a way, moving around the city and come and recognize it. And so I like this kind of, I guess these kind of questions of it, how do you escape, or of fugitivity, right? So there are conditions established, and then there are strategies to, again, get things moving to escape. So yeah, so I thought that was one really interesting moment to think about in this way of unsettling hospitality from the home. The other challenge with the home, of course, is that it is, it's the site where capitalism enter, insofar as the home is about property and it's also about sovereignty. So, and you often have the home again as the sort of micro model of the state. And so I think that for me, this decoupling of hospitality from the home is very powerful, because it sort of allows a kind of disabling of all these other related areas. So any thoughts about that?
I mean, I think that thing, there's a very nice little turn of phrase in your essay, Diego, where you talk about, is it Disney gay, or this sort of commercialized trans glamour that is the sort of okay side, and in a sense, it was one of the things I would say Studio 54 sort of traded on, the idea that you could kind of buy into that. So I suppose in terms of capitalism, I think again, thinking about the piece I was reading, in the end, again, this guy Bertie ends up working as a prostitute and picking up punters as they leave the embassy club. And so, because he sort of becomes excluded from the sort of succeeding group, all the people who go on to form bands, and he ends up, if you like, as a sort of wage slave in that system. Yes, I don't know. I mean, I guess I feel there's sort of two sides to that capitalism, really. There's the sort of private real estate side, but then there's also that who can buy access to safe places, and then who can benefit from that access as well. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, the term you mentioned, it's a Paco Vidarte's term, is this gay land, he's talking about the depoliticized gay subjects for whom being queer or of whatever kind is kind of buried behind other identities. So he's speaking against the idea of gays who might be gay, but kind of like, but I'm gay, but I'm rich and I'm white. So, and whereas Vidarte's ethics would be to put the category that least benefits you in front of everything, instead of hiding that category behind whatever other categories you belong to that may be self-serving for you.
And I have a question from Jillian, and she says, why do you think the fear of the anus is so specific to Brazilian culture? And how can it be evolved away from? Could Andrew's idea about teaching in schools or at a younger age help?
I love this question. Yeah, I don't think it is exclusive to Brazilian culture, but it's particularly exacerbated in very macho, like sexist cultures, which I mean, I don't know that there is any culture where the heterosexual anus is liberated, right? So it's kind of like a precondition in a way, for unfortunately for heterosexuality it's I guess a foundational myth for the heterosexual subject, even though we know that many self-identified heterosexual men utilize their anus for pleasure with their women partners or by themselves. So I think the disavowal of the anus is of course then is something that is foundational to heterosexuality writ large, but it just becomes kind of exacerbated in certain contexts. I think depending on the cultural context, it may be more or less stigmatizing or horrifying to admit to your own self or to others that one has an anus, and that it is a site that is rife with pleasurable possibilities that one might decide to explore or not. But I mean, the idea that that part of the body would be inherently barred from pleasure is, I think, what the issue is, the problem is, right?
So we have time for one last question, if anyone in the audience would like to share. Okay, we have one from Evander Santos. Diego, would you say it's hard for men in Brazil to show some sort of feminine side? And if so, why?
Yes, it's very hard, but not only for men in Brazil, right? It goes back to my previous answer. I think it all harkens back in, I mean, this is a complex question, but it partially harkens back to the idea that ultimately gender difference is, to go back to that what the YouTuber said in my talk, like gender difference, the idea that men are decidedly different from women, hinges on a very, very frail difference, actually, what Jacques Lacan calls the small difference. And then, of course, we built an entire culture and an entire language to play up a difference that's very small. And so anything that will threaten those sorts of foundational myths, or anything that will expose that difference in its smallness, needs to be immediately disavowed, so that the systems we have in place that benefit some as opposed to other remain in place, right?
Okay. And I don't know if Diego, Andrew, you have one last question for each other, or, and if not, I'd like to invite everyone to check into Public's YouTube channel, where the recording of this session will be available. And again, if you would like your question to be withheld, just reach out to us today. And thank you so much, Diego and Andrew, for your wonderful presentations and texts, and to be continued. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.